morning, Leo. Morning, everyone. Again, just to reiterate, really grateful for whether it was yourself or colleagues of yours that attended yesterday's conference. It was a really, really good day. And my favourite bit is obviously it's always nice talking to people about something you've laboured over for a year, but actually really nice just to sort of see people connect to each other and hear that buzz in the room. So thank you ever so much for that. I'm going to share some slides with you. If you were there yesterday, apologies, because you'll have seen this before, but it seemed that the most appropriate way to manage this would be just to give you a very quick sort of run through of what I spoke about at the conference yesterday. Just looking to see you can see those slides. If there was some nods there. Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I picked up a few nods. We began in the pub, and well, in fact, we didn't begin in the pub, but in 1953, two scientists celebrated in this pub the discovery of DNA, and as they called it, the secret of life. And this was a theme that sort of ran through the conference because the paper that we launched yesterday, we talk about the DNA of trust-led school improvement. And there were 2 points really to sort of starting here. One of them was, and here's a version of the plaque that you can see. One of them was about really tapping into the notion of discovery, that sense of trying to find something explanatory, something fundamental, really getting to the principles that explain why things are as they are. Obviously, DNA is a really good metaphor for that, the discovery of DNA. But of course, we're not in our sector perhaps so much interested in that. We're interested, particularly this piece of work, in understanding how trust improves schools. So there's this sense of there's something to work out, there's something to know, there's something to grapple with to know more about that. But the other thing that I said yesterday was that this was a really interesting example of how a community actually builds knowledge over time, because although these two scientists, Crick and Watson, celebrated here in that pub in Cambridge the discovery of DNA. Actually, when you look into this story, you discover that actually the roots of their discovery actually took place over hundreds of years, culminating in that moment in 1953. And there's a really interesting part of the story here. When that plaque first went up in Cambridge at the side of this pub, it mentioned only Crick and Watson. And then, quite rightfully, when that plaque was refreshed a few years ago, they took that opportunity to recognise the role of other scientists, actually, who were working at the same time, whose work fed into that discovery as well, particularly Rosalind Franklin. And we know historically the silencing of female voices in areas like science has been a real issue. So it's really good to see that. And the reason I mentioned it was because, of course, this finding out how trusts improve schools, it's a collaborative thing. And so yesterday was a community conference. This was about bringing together the sector, people who are toiling with this, recognizing that the answer isn't going to come from one person or one trust in particular. It's going to be something that we're going to build. And indeed, there probably isn't going to be one answer to this thing. There are probably going to be several. So that's where we started. And if we sort of think of Crick and Watson as sort of, in a sense, reaching the pinnacle of their particular field, we're probably still somewhere in the foothills of our investigations of how trusts go about improving schools. Now, that's not to say that we've got questions about whether trusts do improve schools. We're really clear. Whether you look at Ofsted evidence, whether you look at what's happening in performance of England internationally, looking at PISA and so on, there's really clear evidence that trusts have made a real impact across the piece in improving education in schools. And we also know there are trusts out there who, that you'll be on the call today, who are systematically improving education across groups of schools. So it's not a question of whether trusts are improving schools. We're really confident that is what's happening. They're at the front line of school improvement. But the evidence around how they do that is reasonably scarce. And part of the reason for that is because there hasn't been a huge amount of academic interest yet, really, in that space. We've seen various papers written about ideological or political questions that various academics have sort of asserted around the trust system, but we've not really seen enough academics really getting into trusts and saying, so you've got a track record of improving schools here in this trust. Let's look at it. Let's get under the bonnet and find out really how you're doing that so that we can build sector knowledge. So that's where we're at. We're still, I think, probably having to do that piece of work ourselves, which is sort of challenging, but also incredibly exciting. So what we did a year ago is we launched our inquiry. Hopefully you remember this. We launched our inquiry into trust-led school improvement, this sort of expedition up those foothills to try and know more about the work that's going on in your organisations. And 14 or so excellent people. We had experts from trusts, trust leaders, and as well as other sector experts and evidence experts who are working with us on that piece of work. And really what we found was pretty quickly, it was hard, and it was hard for a few reasons. It was hard because we encountered different language and concepts being used in trusts. I was doing quite a lot of conversations with CEOs at this point and asking them to just tell me about your trust strategy, or indeed some trusts will talk about having a model of improvement. But when you have those conversations with people, you realize that actually we tend to have quite different ways of talking and thinking about this thing. And I think that's fine. It's not that that's inherently a problem, but it does make comparing practice across trusts particularly hard. So some of you, when I asked you about it, were telling me about your staffing structure. Some of you were telling me about particular pedagogical approaches that your trust was particularly keen on. And some of you were talking to me about strategic documents you have and plans and so on. And it might be that all of those things are super important. But we felt that actually one of the contributions we hope to make through this work is to try and bring together some common language and common concepts that will allow us to sort of compare and contrast what we're doing a little bit more clearly. We also know there are different educational philosophies and purposes in the sector. That's sort of a facet of education, not trusts. We see that in schools, and we see that internationally as well. And that's one reason why this piece of work isn't going to be advocating there is one way of doing this thing, because your way of delivering improvement it entirely depends on, I would imagine, the purposes that you're working towards. So for us, it's not about imposing those philosophies and purposes on you, but it is helping you to understand how your particular philosophies and purposes of education then play down through the way that you lead school improvement across the group. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, a really complicating factor is that it's not that there's no evidence around trust-led improvement, but there's just not a particularly mature evidence base. And we're really hoping that we can help with that. Now, there is lots of evidence about school-level improvement, to be clear. We're not saying for a moment there isn't evidence about school-level improvement, but the particular question of how does a group of schools more effectively improve, that's relatively under-researched. So those are the challenges that we've sort of been grappling with in the inquiry. And this is just a flavour of the sorts of things that colleagues through the inquiry work said. They said they wanted this to be sector-owned. We've had DFE observers attending our inquiry meetings. We also had 2 DFE colleagues at the conference yesterday. It was really good to see government interested in this piece of work, but being really clear with you, it's owned by the sector. So this is a sector-led thing. We think that's really, really important. Also, the steer from the inquiry group is this shouldn't just be a static report. So yes, we published a report yesterday, but frankly, it's probably not the main event. What's in it, we think the conceptual model that I'll talk about in a moment is important, but it's what we do with it that really counts. And I've got some more to say about that in a moment. We want this to be something that is a living, breathing, active ingredient of improvement in the system, something we're going to sustain over time. And as I say, we wanted to focus on what trusts are doing in particular. So it needs to focus on overarching principles so that it can speak to a range of contexts, a range of philosophies of education and so on. We want it to focus on the organisation and not only on leadership traits. It's not that it's necessarily blind to leadership traits, but we think there's already some evidence and research around that. We want to offer something different into the system. So this doesn't get into sort of, what sort of leader are you? We're focusing on the organisational level. And then I think I've talked about those other bits on the slide already, so I'm going to move us on. So what we launched yesterday was, among other things, a conceptual model, okay? And it's called a conceptual model because it sits at a very abstract level. So it's not telling you, in order to improve education in your trusts, you should, for example, focus on improving behaviour and this is how you do it. Although, of course, it may well be that focusing on behaviour is a really important part of school improvement in a lot of trusts. But we're not offering that prescription because we're taking a step back and we're offering a higher level conceptual framework. And what the conceptual framework does effectively is it starts to unpick and offer some language and concepts around what an improvement strategy, model, or approach ought to attend to in some way, thinking about it in terms of the process that a trust has to go through. So whilst it doesn't speak particularly to, behaviour or curriculum in the model, we're absolutely imagining that you could apply the model to improving, for example, behaviour across a trust or curriculum across a trust, or indeed a range of foci across your organisation. So it doesn't specify the what, but it does outline aspects, we think, of the organisational how. We also want to make really clear that this is not about doing more, more, more. We recognise the stresses and strains that you as trusts and your colleagues are under. So one of the really important components of the model is this notion of de-implementation. Some of the most effective and important decisions we make as leaders are about what we stop doing. So that features in the model as well. And what we hope to do is we hope you're going to use this. And I've already had really kind messages from trust leaders who have said to me, actually, this is really helpful because we're looking at refreshing how we do our school improvement strategy. We want a lens to hold up to it. This has come at exactly the right time for us. That's really good. If it's not yet the right time for you and you're looking at that 6 months down the line, it's still going to be there and hopefully it'll be useful to you then. But it's going to do something else for us as well. It's going to connect us together, we hope, into that sector-wide conversation and allow us to start to build more concrete evidence about what these things look like in trusts, offer case studies and so on, and hopefully build some synthesis of that data so that we can help you to know more about how to do this thing more effectively. Now, I won't read all of this out, but the model itself draws on, of course, it draws on educational research, but it also draws on research and models from other sectors. So we've got business and industry in here, we've got healthcare in here, we've got education in here, we've got like a Challenge Partners, for example, has been really helpful in shaping this, as has the EEF's updated implementation guidance. If you haven't seen that, that was published a week ago. We're really grateful to the EEF for working with us to help make sure that what we're saying is really helpfully aligned with that guidance that they've just produced. And we were really pleased to have Professor Jonathan Sharp, who yesterday came to the session and ran a workshop for us on that new implementation guidance. And we also take account of complexity theory, the sense that there isn't necessarily a straight line. School improvement can be unpredictable. So this is not a linear process. These are facets of improvement that we think that your organisation probably needs to think about and attend to in some way. So this is the model. It consists of 3 strands. So coming back to DNA, you'll know, I'm sure, that DNA is a double helix structure. Well, we wanted to go one better. We've got a triple helix. And if you're a scientist and you tell me that there's no such thing as a triple helix, I can tell you, I've researched it, there is. It's rare in nature, but it is a thing. We've got 3 strands that we think are really important. One of them is about being really clear on your goals as an organisation. You notice we've chosen that language carefully, curate clear goals. It may be that some of these goals are decided as a trust and held together. Or it might be that indeed some of the goal-making processes and the goals themselves are devolved to individual schools within the organisation. But in either case, we think the trust probably needs to have some overview of that. So that curation is deliberate choice of language. So curating clear goals, building capability and capacity, because all the research across those range of sectors says if we don't match our aims and ambitions and our plans for delivery with the capacity and the capability to deliver, then we're always going to come unstuck. So that's a really important part of the model for us. And then finally, implementing improvement initiatives. And that's partly where we'll draw on that EEF research, for example, and some other things in that space as well. Now, each one of those 3 strands is broken down into 4 components, giving us 12 in total. And what we had at the conference yesterday, we had 12 workshops, each workshop focused on showcasing one trust or one organization's expertise in relation to one of these areas. And it may well be that in your organisation you want to look at all of these, or it may well be you've got something really interesting happening across all of these, or it might be that you're dabbling your toe into the water of 1 or 2 of these, or indeed you think you've got really compelling practice in relation to 1 or 2 of these. So you don't have to look at the whole thing in order for it to make sense. We imagine that some trusts will use this to focus in on particular areas or to think more deeply about what they're doing in relation to particular parts of this. But it's that triple helix, the sense that all of these things have to come together in order for us to deliver successful school improvement. And then if we break that down, you'll see that we've got these things here. I'm not going to share these with you in detail this morning. I'm just going to flash them up on the screen. My hope is that at some point today or in the week ahead, you'll have an opportunity to sort of look at this at your leisure. But you can see, look, we've got the strand here, curating clear goals, the 4 components. We can tell you what it means. We can give you some examples of what that might look like in practice. And in one of the papers, we've also got some questions that we thought might be useful for you perhaps to talk about, whether it's as a trust team or across your group of head teachers, to be able to say, actually, what does this look like for us? Do we have answers to these questions? If we don't, should we? If we do, what are they? Okay, so there's some stimulating questions in there for you. So that's the first strand, second strand on capability and capacity, and then the third strand on implementing improvement initiatives. So that's the model, okay? But we don't stop there. What we did yesterday is we explored the conceptual model. We had keynotes that talked to particular parts of it. So, for example, when we're talking about that goal setting piece, we started the day with a really interesting keynote from Professor Lee Elliott Major talking to us about children, disadvantaged children, or as he talks about them, children from under-resourced backgrounds. And it was really, really interesting and helped us to think about what, those educational purposes that we're aiming for. And of course, we know that particularly the plight of disadvantaged children, disadvantaged communities, is a really important thing for the trust sector, where so much of the work that we do has come from that mission. We then had those 12 workshops focusing on the components. We had a peer networking session, and also then we launched a call for evidence that's being led by colleagues at Impact Ed. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a second. We launched 4 papers. So we launched a main sort of paper that describes the model, that gives the evidence base for it and so on, and the rationale for it. We also launched a guide which tells trusts and other organisations how they might like to use this. We've got a third paper here from Professor, I've promoted him, Dr. Sam Sims. I'm sure he will be Professor very soon. He's done a lovely research review for us looking at evidence from America and school groups in America to see what the evidence might suggest there. Are there any clues in the evidence base, things that we might like to consider? And then we also had a 4th paper from our community supporters at Step Lab, who are looking particularly at de-implementation and how we match that with developing expertise, so CPD, and that paper is available for you to view as well. So all of these things are available for you to have a look at. They're not restricted to folk at the conference, indeed quite the opposite. We're also publishing 3 case studies. We're going to have one this is from Northern Education Trust, that's going to be released in 2 weeks' time. We have launched one yesterday from Lighthouse, and then we're going to have Danes releasing one next week. So we've got one all ready to go. We've got one coming next week, and then we've got another one coming in 2 weeks' time. 3 case studies looking at parts of that conceptual model, drilling into it and saying this is what it looks like for us in our trust and how this helps to deliver on our educational purposes. And all of those things that I've just shared with you, the papers, the conceptual model, the case studies, they are all held on a new website that we launched yesterday, which is called the School Improvement Hub. And you'll see our triple helix logo on that. This is something that we're doing in partnership with Impact Ed. It's the place where we're sharing those initial inputs with you, but it's also somewhere where we're making an ask of you. Because what we're now saying to the sector is, look, here's the model, here's some case studies to get us started, but we want to know more. So we're inviting you to share with us your expertise, what's working in your trust in terms of school improvement. And we particularly want to hear from trusts who have got that really compelling track record around improving schools. And it doesn't have to be that you've got the answers to all 12 components. As I said earlier, it may just be that there are particular parts of this conceptual model and you think you've got something really interesting and powerful to share with the sector. So if you go to this website, it's called www.schoolimprovementhub.org. If you go there, you'll see nice and clearly there's a call for evidence button. You can click on that. It'll take you to the call for evidence. And there's just a few boxes where we're just asking you for some initial information, and then we'll be making contact with trusts, or rather Impact will be making contact with trusts following that. So we're going to get more case studies. We're also going to hopefully get some really broad synthesis of information across the sector, and we're going to use that to build that sector knowledge. So finally, just to close out my little talk this morning, what we said yesterday is that we started with that celebration in the pub in 1953 of the discovery of DNA. We're not claiming that we've discovered anything in the way that Crick and Watson did quite yet. And indeed, it probably isn't ever going to look quite the same as their discovery. But we certainly think that there's a really important job for us to do to connect up trusts into, oh crikey, I've just lost my PowerPoint, bear with me, I'm back. A really important job to connect trusts to that common set of concepts, common language. And we think, and all the sort of the conversation yesterday told us, we feel like we've landed in the right place. Leaders yesterday told us they think this is useful. They're looking forward to using this in their trusts. And I suppose I'm just going to end with that invitation to you. Take it away, try it on, see how it works for you. And please, please, please join us in that call for evidence, because together is how we're going to build this thing. Thank you so much, everyone.